October 14, 1942. The North Atlantic, latitude 53 degrees north, longitude 35 degrees west. In the freezing darkness of the mid-Atlantic gap, a region known to sailors as the Black Pit, the mathematical probability of survival was exactly 0.04%. On one side of this equation stood 3 Type 7C German U-boats, a coordinated wolf pack representing 2,300 tons of specialized lethality. They carried a combined total of 42 G7E torpedoes, each packed with 620 pounds of Skigwal 36 explosive. Their surfaced speed was 17.7 knots, and their crews were some of the most experienced hunters in the Kriegsmarine. On the other side stood the SS Ardent Spirit. She was a 7,000-ton freighter, a lumbering mass of merchant steel designed to carry bulk grain, not to hunt predators. Her triple expansion steam engines were rated for a maximum of 220 psi, providing a sluggish top speed of 11 knots on a calm day. Her armor consisted of half-inch mild steel plates, barely thick enough to withstand the pressure of the North Atlantic waves, let alone a torpedo strike. Her only teeth were a single 4-inch Mark IV deck gun mounted on the stern, a weapon designed for a sustained fire rate of 5 rounds per minute. The German Wolfpack had a speed advantage of nearly 7 knots. They had the Ardent Spirit outnumbered 3-1. They had her outgunned 42-0 in the water. According to the Merchant Marine Operating Manual, the protocol for a lone freighter under attack was simple: maintain course, emit a distress signal, and prepare the lifeboats for immediate evacuation. The logic of 1942 dictated that the Ardent Spirit was already a ghost ship. But on this night, the crew of the Ardent Spirit decided that the manual was nothing more than fuel for the furnace. What followed over the next 48 hours was a defiance of naval engineering and a rejection of the laws of probability. If you want to see how a cargo ship rated for grain became the most dangerous predator in the Atlantic, continue watching. By late 1942, the Battle of the Atlantic had reached a fever pitch. The Allies were desperate to keep the lifeline to Great Britain open, but the German U-boat fleet, under the command of Admiral Karl Dönitz, was strangling the supply routes. This specific area of the ocean, the mid-Atlantic gap, was a 1,000-mile wide stretch where Allied land-based aircraft could not reach. Here, merchant ships were beyond the protection of the Royal Air Force or the United States Army Air Forces. They were alone in the dark, and the U-boats knew it. The SS Ardent Spirit was part of Convoy SC-104, a slow-moving collection of 48 merchant ships escorted by a handful of corvettes and destroyers. The Ardent Spirit was carrying 9,000 tons of Canadian wheat and heavy machinery parts, essential cargo for the war effort in Europe. At the helm was Captain Thorne, a 44-year-old veteran of the merchant service who had spent 20 years navigating the world's most dangerous waters. Thorne was not a military man by trade, but he possessed a cold, analytical mind and a deep understanding of his ship's mechanical limits. The heart of the Ardent Spirit was a massive triple expansion steam engine. This mechanical beast used high-pressure steam in 3 stages, passing it through a high-pressure cylinder, an intermediate cylinder, and finally a large low-pressure cylinder to turn a single massive propeller shaft. It was a reliable design, but it was built for economy, not performance. The 2 Scotch marine boilers that fed this engine were designed to operate at a steady 220 pounds per square inch. To go beyond that was to risk a catastrophic boiler explosion that would turn the ship into a cloud of shrapnel and scalding steam in seconds. Opposing her were the Type 7C U-boats, the workhorses of the German submarine fleet. These were sleek, 70-60-meter-long vessels, powered by twin German-Yaft 6-cylinder diesel engines. They were designed to operate on the surface at night, using their low profile to remain invisible while they utilized their superior speed to position themselves ahead of slow convoys. Once in position, they would submerge and wait for their prey to pass directly into their crosshairs. The crisis began at 0200 hours on October 14th. A Force 8 gale had been battering Convoy SC-104 for 12 hours. Force 8 on the Beaufort scale means winds of 34 to 40 knots and waves reaching heights of 25 feet. The North Atlantic was a chaotic landscape of white foam and crushing water. In the blinding spray and the pitch-black night, visibility dropped to less than 50 yards. The Ardent Spirit, heavily laden and struggling against the headwind, began to lose ground. Her 11 knots were reduced to 6 as she slammed into the massive swells. By 3:30 in the morning, the lights of the nearest escort vessel had vanished. The Ardent Spirit was alone. At 4:15, the ship's radio operator received a frantic, broken transmission. Another merchant ship in the convoy, the SS Firedrake, had been hit. 2 torpedoes. She sank in less than 4 minutes. The Wolfpack was here. Captain Thorne stood on the bridge, his hands gripped tight on the railing. He knew that a lone freighter, separated from its escorts in a gale, was the easiest target in the ocean. The U-boats didn't even need to submerge. They could stalk her on the surface, using their superior speed to run circles around her until they were ready for the kill. The first contact was not visual. It was a vibration. Arthur Penelagon, the chief engineer, felt it through the soles of his boots in the engine room, 40 feet below the waterline. It was the distinct, rhythmic pulse of high-speed diesel engines. The U-boats were closing in. On the bridge, the lookout spotted a flash of white water, 2,000 yards off the port quarter. It was the bow wave of a surfaced submarine, cutting through the swells at 16 knots. Thorne looked at his watch. The sun wouldn't rise for another 3 hours. In that time, the U-boats could fire their entire spread of torpedoes with near-perfect accuracy. He looked at the Merchant Marine Manual sitting on the chart table. It advised him to maintain a steady course to allow escorts to find him. But there were no escorts. Following the manual would make the Ardent Spirit a stationary target. Thorne picked up the voice tube to the engine room. "Chief," he said, his voice calm but sharp, "we have company, 3 of them. If we stay at 11 knots, we're dead by dawn. I need everything this ship has. And then I need more." Penelagon, a man who treated his boilers like his own children, knew exactly what the captain was asking. He was asking to break the machine. He was asking to push the pressure gauges into the red zone, where the steel of the boilers would begin to soften, and the rivets would start to groan. The manual said 220 Ps. I was the limit. Penelagon looked at the heavy iron safety valves, designed to pop open and vent steam if the pressure exceeded the safety margin. He didn't hesitate. He called for his 2 strongest stokers and a length of iron rebar. They climbed atop the scalding boilers, the air temperature in the engine room already climbing past 110 degrees Fahrenheit. With the ship pitching 20 degrees in the gale, they began to jam the rebar into the safety valve assemblies, physically locking them shut. They were effectively turning the Ardent Spirit into a 7,000-ton floating bomb. "If this goes wrong," Arthur Thorne's voice crackled through the tube, "we won't even feel the torpedoes." "If I give you the steam," Captain Penelagon replied, "you'd better use it to turn this tub into a racehorse." Down in the stokehold, the black gang began shoveling coal with a fury that defied human endurance. The firebox doors were thrown open, bathing the sweating men in a hellish orange glow. They weren't just feeding a fire, they were stoking a revolution. The pressure needle on the main gauge began to crawl. 225, 240, 260. The pipes began to scream as the superheated steam forced its way through valves that were never meant to handle such volume. On the surface, the lead U-boat, U-552, commanded by a confident Oberleutnant, was preparing to move into a firing position. He expected the freighter to behave like every other cargo ship he had, hunted a slow, predictable target that would try to zigzag in a desperate, futile attempt to escape. He signaled the other 2 boats in his pack to flank the target. They would bracket her, firing from 3 different angles to ensure a hit. But as the U-boats increased their speed to 17 knots to get ahead of the Ardent Spirit, something impossible happened. The freighter didn't slow down. She didn't even maintain her speed. The massive bow of the Ardent Spirit rose out of the water, smashing through a 20-foot swell with a violence that sent sheets of freezing spray over her entire length. The vibration from the propeller shaft became a roar that shook the very rivets of the hull. The Ardent Spirit wasn't doing 11 knots anymore. She was doing 14, then 15. As the pressure in the boilers hit 300 psi, nearly 36%, above the failure limit, the freighter surged to 16.5 knots. The German commander adjusted his binoculars in disbelief. A ship of that class, carrying that much weight, should have been physically incapable of such speed. His calculated torpedo solutions were suddenly worthless. The prey had just found a new gear, and the 48-hour hunt had only just begun. Inside the hull of the SS Ardent Spirit, the laws of thermodynamics were being rewritten at a terrifying cost. The engine room had become a pressurized furnace. The ambient temperature had soared to 138 degrees Fahrenheit. Men were not just sweating. They were losing consciousness from heat exhaustion every 20 minutes, replaced by volunteers from the deck crew who had never seen the inside of a boiler room. Chief Engineer Penelagon stood at the main throttle, his hand wrapped in a thick, oily rag to prevent the blistering heat of the metal from searing his skin. The triple expansion engine, designed for a steady 65 revolutions per minute, was now screaming at 94. The massive steel connecting rods, each weighing over 2 tons, were moving with a blur of kinetic energy that made the entire 7,000-ton hull vibrate with a high-frequency hum. This wasn't the rhythmic thumping of a merchant ship. It was the frantic heartbeat of a prey animal pushed into a terminal sprint. Every 30 seconds, a rivet in the bulkheads would fail under the stress, popping out of its socket with the sound of a pistol shot and ricocheting across the steel floor. The pressure was now holding steady at 315 psi. This was 45% above the catastrophic failure limit. If a single steam pipe burst, the resulting cloud of 300-degree vapor would strip the flesh from the bones of every man in the engine room in less than 2 seconds. Penelagon knew this. Every man with a shovel in his hand knew this. But they also knew that the alternative was a 600-pound warhead of German TNT detonating against their hull. On the surface, 1,500 yards off the starboard beam, Oberleutnant Klaus von Richter, on the bridge of U-552, was experiencing a crisis of logic. He had fired a spread of 3 G7E torpedoes at a range of 2,000 yards, calculated for a target speed of 11 knots. By the time the torpedoes reached the intercept point, the Ardent Spirit was already 400 yards ahead of the impact zone. "The target is accelerating," the U-boat's hydrophone operator reported, his voice trembling with confusion. "Speed is now 17 knots. That is impossible for a freighter of that displacement." Richter looked through his Zeiss binoculars. The Ardent Spirit was not just moving fast. She was maneuvering with a violent agility that defied her design. Captain Thorne was executing hard rudder turns, throwing the massive ship into zigzags that put a permanent 12-degree list on the hull. The structural frame of the ship groaned as the 9,000 tons of grain shifted slightly in the hold. A 12-degree list meant that the deck was now a permanent slope, making it nearly impossible for the crew to move without holding on to safety lines. But the speed was working. The wake of the Ardent Spirit was a chaotic white scar on the black Atlantic, a trail of broken water that made it impossible for the U-boats to get a clean acoustic lock. But the German Wolfpack was not easily discouraged. Seeing that torpedoes were being wasted against this freakish speed, the commander of the second submarine, U-203, decided to change tactics. He signaled for a surface engagement. The logic was cold. If the ship was too fast for submerged torpedoes, they would use their 88mm deck guns to disable her rudder and then finish her at their leisure. At 12:45 a.m., U-203 breached the surface 3,000 yards behind the Ardent Spirit. The German gun crew scrambled onto the deck, their boots slipping on the wet steel as they unlimbered the deck gun. They were professionals, capable of firing 18 rounds per minute. They expected the merchant ship to be a helpless target, a sitting duck with a single, outdated gun that wouldn't even be manned in this weather. They were wrong. On the stern of the Ardent Spirit, the gun crew was led by Samuel Oxmiller, a former heavyweight boxer from Liverpool who had traded his gloves for a loading tray. His crew consisted of 4 men, all of them shivering in the freezing spray, but their hands were steady. The 4-inch mark for deck gun was an old weapon, but Thorne had ensured it was meticulously maintained. The manual for the Mark IV specified a sustained fire rate of 5 rounds per minute to prevent the barrel from overheating and the recoil fluid from boiling. Miller looked at the surfaced U-boat, its deck gun already flashing in the dark. Ignore the manual. Miller roared over the sound of the gale. I want a shell in that breach every 4 seconds. If the barrel melts, we'll use it as a spear. The first German 88mm shell whistled over the Ardent Spirit's funnel, exploding in the water 50 yards to port. The shock wave sent a wall of freezing water over the deck. Miller's crew didn't flinch. They slammed the first 31-pound high-explosive shell into the breach. Range, 2800. Fire. The 4-inch gun erupted with a muzzle flash that illuminated the entire stern in a blinding white light. The recoil was so violent that the mounting bolts, already stressed by the ship's speed, began to groan. The first shot was long, splashing 100 yards behind the U-boat. Miller adjusted the elevation by hand, his muscles straining against the gears as the ship pitched and rolled in the force 8 gale. The second shot was closer. The third was a near miss that sent a geyser of water over the U-boat's conning tower. The German commander, shocked by the volume of fire coming from a mere merchant ship, ordered his gunners to speed up. But the Ardent Spirit's crew was doing the unthinkable. They were pushing the mark for 15 rounds per minute. The barrel paint began to blister and peel away in charred flakes. The recoil fluid, the oil used to dampen the shock of the gun firing, began to smoke and then boil, emitting a foul, acrid stench. The metal of the gun was becoming so hot that it glowed a dull, angry red in the darkness. Every time a new shell was loaded, the crew had to be careful not to touch the breech with their bare skin, or it would fuse instantly to the metal. At 13 minutes past 1 in the morning, the Ardent Spirit achieved the impossible. A 4-inch shell, traveling at 2,000 feet per second, struck the base of U-203's conning tower. The impact was catastrophic. The thin pressure hull of the submarine offered no resistance to a 31-pound armor-piercing shell. The explosion tore through the command center, killing the commander and the bridge crew instantly. U-203 didn't just stop firing. She began to founder. The internal bulkheads collapsed under the pressure of the Atlantic, and within 90 seconds, the second hunter of the Wolfpack had disappeared beneath the waves, leaving nothing but a slick of diesel oil and debris. But there was no time for celebration. On the bridge, Thorne saw the radar operator go pale. Captain, U-552 and the third boat, U-401, are closing from both flanks. They've seen what happened to their sister ship. They're not going to use deck guns anymore. They're coming in for a simultaneous submerged attack. The stakes had just doubled. The Ardent Spirit had used her speed and her gun to take out one predator, but she had revealed her hand. The remaining 2 E-boats were now aware that this was no ordinary freighter. They began to submerge, disappearing into the black water. Thorne knew that somewhere beneath the surface, 16 torpedoes were being readied. The emotional weight began to press down on the bridge crew. It wasn't just fear. It was a profound sense of isolation. They were in the middle of a graveyard, surrounded by invisible killers, on a ship that was literally shaking itself to pieces. Thorne looked at his men. They were exhausted, covered in salt and soot, their eyes red from lack of sleep and the constant sting of the wind. "We've killed one," Thorne said, his voice dropping to a low, steady tone that commanded attention. "The math says we shouldn't be here. The Germans think we're a fluke. They think we got lucky. We're going to prove to them that this ship isn't a fluke. It's a coffin and we're the ones who decide who goes inside." Down in the engine room, Penelagon was facing a new crisis. The intense vibration had caused the main condenser to start leaking. If the salt water contaminated the boiler feed, the boilers would scale up and explode within the hour. He had to make a choice: slow down and fix the leak, or keep the speed and risk the explosion. "Don't you dare touch that throttle, Arthur," a voice said from the shadows. It was the lead stoker, a man whose chest was covered in second-degree steam burns. "We'll plug the leak with our own clothes if we have to. Just keep the steam coming." They used strips of canvas and raw tallow to jam into the leaking seams of the condenser, the men working in waist-deep, scalding water. It was a brutal, primitive form of engineering, but it held. The Ardent Spirit maintained her 16 knots, her hull screaming in protest, a ghost ship of fire and steel charging through the North Atlantic night. Then, the turning point of the second night arrived. The radio operator intercepted a coded burst. It wasn't from a U-boat. It was an Allied Huff-Duff high-frequency direction-finding station on the coast of Iceland. They had picked up the U-boat's transmissions. Help was coming, but it was still 12 hours away. 12 hours. In naval combat, 12 hours is an eternity. Thorne realized that they couldn't just run. If they kept running in a straight line, the U-boats would eventually get ahead of them. To survive, the Ardent Spirit had to do the one thing no merchant ship had ever done in the history of the war. She had to stop being the prey. She had to become the hunter. Helm, Thorne commanded, his eyes fixed on the dark horizon where the last known position of U-552 was recorded. Hard to port. We're going back. Back, sir, the helmsman asked, his voice cracking. We're going to find them before they find us. We're going to use our wake to mask our noise, and we're going to ram the first thing that shows a periscope. The Ardent Spirit, 7,000 tons of steel and wheat, swung around in a massive, foaming arc. She was no longer fleeing toward England. She was heading directly back into the heart of the Wolfpack. Her boilers screaming at 315 psi, her gun crew standing ready by a barrel that was still smoking. The prey had just turned around, and the hunters were about to find out that the math of survival had changed forever. 0300 hours. The North Atlantic was a void of black water and white foam. But inside the SS Ardent Spirit, the world was a screaming symphony of overstressed iron. Captain Thorne's decision to turn the ship back was not a maneuver found in any merchant navy textbook. It was a tactical gamble that relied on a single terrifying variable. The Ardent Spirit was now faster than the remaining U-boats could travel while submerged. By turning back into her own wake, the freighter was using the massive turbulence of her overdriven propeller to mask her acoustic signature, effectively blinding the hydrophones of U-552 and U-401. The ship was still maintaining 16.2 knots, a speed that felt like a slow-motion explosion to the men below decks. The pressure in the Scotch boilers was holding at 315 psi, but the strain was reaching a breaking point. The main steam line was vibrating with an amplitude of nearly 4 inches, threatening to tear itself from the bulkheads. Chief Engineer Penelagon had ordered his men to evacuate the upper gratings of the engine room. If a pipe burst now, the high-pressure steam would turn the entire space into a lethal pressure cooker in less than 3 seconds. Look out, eyes on the water. Thorne roared over the gale. I'm looking for a feather. Anything that breaks the swell. A feather was the small wake created by a periscope cutting through the surface. At 15 minutes past 3, the starboard lookout screamed, "Periscope, 2 o'clock, 800 yards, and closing." Thorne didn't hesitate. He didn't order a turn away. He didn't signal for a zigzag. Hard to starboard, full ahead. We're going to run him down. The 7,000-ton freighter leaned into the turn, her 12-degree list making the maneuver feel like the ship was about to capsize. The hull groaned as the weight of 9,000 tons of grain shifted against the port bulkheads. U-552, commanded by Richter, had been caught in the middle of a submerged approach. He had expected the freighter to continue its flight toward the east. He never expected 7,000 tons of merchant steel to charge directly at his position at 16 knots. Richter tried to dive, but the physics were against him. A Type 7C U-boat, at periscope depth, takes nearly 30 seconds to reach a safe depth. The Ardent Spirit was covering 800 yards in less than 90 seconds. The U-boat was a 1,200-ton cylinder of steel. The Ardent Spirit was a 7,000-ton hammer. The impact was not a loud explosion, but a sickening, prolonged grind of metal against metal. The reinforced bow of the Ardent Spirit, designed to withstand North Atlantic ice, sliced into the pressure hull of U-552 just aft of the conning tower. The freighter didn't even slow down. She rode up over the submarine, her massive weight crushing the U-boat's ballast tanks and snapping the pressure hull like a dry twig. For those on the bridge of the Ardent Spirit, the sensation was a series of violent jolts that nearly threw them off their feet. Below the waterline, U-552 was literally torn in two. The Atlantic Ocean rushed into the German submarine at a rate of 4,000 gallons per second. There were no survivors. The second hunter had been eliminated by the very prey it had intended to consume. But the victory came at a price. The impact had buckled the Ardent Spirit's forward collision bulkhead. Seawater began pouring into the number 1 hold at a rate of 500 gallons per minute. The ship's bow began to settle, increasing the drag and forcing the engines to work even harder to maintain speed. "We're taking on water, Captain," the first mate shouted. "If we don't slow down, the pressure will blow the bulkhead." "If we slow down," Thorne replied, "the third boat will put a torpedo through our engine room. We keep the speed. Chief, I need more steam." The final predator, U-401, was now the only hunter left. Its commander was cautious. He had seen the Ardent Spirit sink 2 of his sister ships through sheer, violent defiance. He stayed submerged, trailing the freighter from 3,000 yards, waiting for the ship to eventually fail. He knew the freighter was damaged. He could see the bow sitting lower in the water. He was playing the long game, waiting for the Ardent Spirit to lose her speed so he could deliver a coup de grace torpedo from a safe distance. Thorne knew he couldn't win a game of patience. His boilers were dying, his forward hold was flooding, and his crew was at the edge of total collapse. He needed to lure U-401 to the surface. He needed the German commander to think the Ardent Spirit was finished. Chief Thorne called down to the engine room. "Give me the smokescreen. Use the oily rags. I want this ship to look like she's burning from the inside out." In the stokehold, the men began throwing bundles of oil-soaked rags and wet coal into the furnaces. They partially blocked the dampers, forcing the exhaust to become thick, black, and billowy. From the outside, the Ardent Spirit appeared to be suffering from a massive internal fire. Thick plumes of greasy smoke poured from the funnel, masking the stern and trailing for miles across the water. Thorne then ordered the engines to be slowed to 5 knots. The ruse worked. The commander of U-401, seeing the black smoke and the sudden drop in speed, assumed the freighter's boilers had finally exploded, or that the internal fires had become uncontrollable. He didn't want to waste another expensive torpedo on a dying ship. He ordered U-401 to surface 2,000 yards off the port quarter, intending to use his deck gun to finish the job. As the U-boat breached the surface, its crew scrambled toward their gun. They saw the Ardent Spirit wallowing in the waves, a mountain of smoke and fire. But, as the U-boat leveled its gun, the smoke screen suddenly parted. Ox Miller and his gun crew had been waiting. They had used the smoke to mask their movements, preloading the 4-inch Mark IV with its final armor-piercing shell. The barrel of the gun was still a charred, blistered mess from the previous engagement, its temperature estimated at over 450 degrees Fahrenheit. Range, 1800. Mark Miller screamed. The Ardent Spirit didn't fire a warning shot. They fired for the kill. The first 4-inch shell struck the U-boat's deck just forward of the conning tower, detonating the ready-use ammunition for the German deck gun. The resulting explosion was a fireball that rose 50 feet into the air. Miller's crew slammed another shell into the glowing breach. They fired again and again. In the span of 60 seconds, they pumped 14 shells into U-401. The U-boat never had a chance to fire a single return shot. The final hit struck the submarine's fuel bunkers. A massive secondary explosion ripped the U-boat apart, sending a shockwave across the water that shattered the remaining glass in the Ardent Spirit's bridge. As the echoes of the explosion died away, U-401 followed its sisters to the bottom. The wolf pack was gone. 3 submarines, 48 torpedoes, and over 150 elite German submariners had been defeated by a single cargo ship and a crew that refused to die. The silence that followed was deafening. But the battle wasn't over. The Ardent Spirit was dying. At 0400 hours, the main steam line finally gave way. A jagged crack appeared in the high-pressure cylinder, and the engine room was instantly filled with a roar of escaping steam. Penelagon managed to trip the emergency shut-off valves before the entire space became a death trap. But the ship was now dead in the water. The forward hold was 30% full of water. The ship had a permanent 15-degree list to starboard. The 9,000 tons of grain were soaking up the seawater, turning into a heavy, fermented sludge that threatened to pull the ship under. For the next 8 hours, the crew fought a different kind of war against gravity and the Atlantic. They formed bucket brigades. They patched bulkheads with mattresses and wooden shores, and they waited. At 12:30 p.m. on October 16th, a smudge of smoke appeared on the horizon. It wasn't a U-boat. It was the HMS Bulldog, a VNW-class destroyer, racing at 30 knots. They had tracked the huffed-up signals and the sounds of the underwater explosions. When the destroyer arrived, the crew of the Bulldog stood on their decks in stunned silence. They saw a blackened, battered freighter listing heavily to one side. Its funnel charred, and its deck gun barrel melted into a grotesque shape. The Ardent Spirit was towed into Liverpool 3 days later. When the port authorities inspected the ship, they refused to believe the captain's log. They found that the boilers had been pushed to nearly 500% of their rated stress during the final sprints. They found the fringe gun was so heat damaged that the rifling had been smoothed away entirely. They found the bow was crushed inward by nearly 6 feet from the ramming of U-552. According to the official naval records of the Second World War, the SS Ardent Spirit is the only merchant freighter credited with the confirmed destruction of 3 U-boats in a single 48-0 engagement. The mathematical probability of their survival had been 0.04%. They had beaten those odds by exactly 100%. Captain Elias Thorne and Chief Engineer Arthur Penelagon were both awarded the Lloyd's Medal for bravery at sea. Samuel Oxmiller and his gun crew received the Distinguished Service Cross. But for the men who survived those 48 hours, the real reward wasn't the medals. It was the knowledge that they had broken the machine to save the men. They had proven that when the math says you are dead, the only logical solution is to change the equation. If this story of the Ardent Spirit's defiance has moved you, please leave a like. It helps ensure that the names of men like Elias Thorne and Arthur Penelagon are never forgotten by history. These were ordinary men in an extraordinary machine, doing the impossible when everyone else said it couldn't be done. The SS Ardent Spirit was eventually repaired and returned to service. She survived the rest of the war, completing 24 more Atlantic crossings. She was a ship designed to carry grain, but she will forever be remembered as the ship that carried vengeance. The story of the Ardent Spirit reminds us that limits are often just suggestions made by people who aren't fighting for their lives. When the pressure is too high and the odds are too low, the human spirit can reach a PSI that no boiler can contain. Thank you for watching this tribute to the crew of the SS Ardent Spirit. If you want to see more stories of impossible naval survival, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon. Comment below, do you think the U-boat commanders were overconfident, or was the Ardent Spirit simply a ship that refused to follow the rules of war? We want to hear your thoughts. You aren't just a viewer. You are part of the crew that keeps these memories alive. This was the story of the ship that broke the machine to win the war. Thank you for watching.